Coming up this weekend, Jonathan Pearce. He's a grappler. He's a trendsetter. He's the bane of Matt Allen's existence. And he's going to be taking on 2022's European most interesting fighter in the world, number 2 behind, well, you guessed it, Ashkar Mazarov. It's Makwan Amirkhani. And Matt, I know you have a lot to say about this fight.
If I may, Craig, you know how sometimes on these cards we like to say, hey, this is almost like Dana White gave us the power to put the fight together, and it's one of those fights that it's kind of our underground kings, if you will. This is the opposite of that. I would never put these two guys together. Exactly. Because here's the thing. You want to know who never gets a Jonathan Pearce or a Makwan Amirkhani fight, right? It's your boy over here. So I can only imagine how wrong my prediction is going to be for this matchup. I'll give it back to you.
So, Matt, like I say, bane of your existence. And do I add 2022 Makwan Amirkhani to that category? Because if you look at it, I mean, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That's an Aristotle quote. And when I look at Makwan Amirkhani, is it just this year? Or is it just, like, again, makes his UFC debut years and years ago, back in 2015 in January. And it's like, wow, this guy knocked out Andy Ogle in 8 seconds. Is he the most interesting man in the world? So Tapology changes his picture. And we all know what it looks like. I saw Clint threw it out there on Twitter, Diehard MMA Pod. And listen, it comes up every time we're in a Makwan Amirkhani fight. But you look at it like he lost his last 3 fights going into his last one. He was 1 of 4 in his 5 on in. He was taking on Mike Grundy. It was at the O2. So this fight was 4 months ago, the last card that was over there in March. And Grundy had, like, it's hard to address, but his father was, his father was very sick. And the commentary team focused on it. The cameras focused on it. Mike Grundy, you could tell, was amped up. Goes for a takedown attempt, runs into a submission, gets submitted in 57 seconds, and Makwan gets a performance bonus. And it's like, what? Where's this Makwan been? Because Makwan is a guy, and we talked about Mandy Bohm, who's also on this card. She used to train out of SBG. She had all her success her last time out. She wasn't training there. She lost her UFC debut. Makwan was an SBG Ireland guy for the longest time. Opens up the MA Training Center, which is Makwan's gym. Also trains kind of close to home in Finland as well. But when you do look at it, Matt, like, I haven't seen giant leaps and bounds in Makwan's game. The 3-fight losing streak, I thought, geez, like, is he on the back 9? You consider it too. Like, he's 7-5 in the UFC since 2015 when he had that 8-second win over Andy Ogle. And only one fighter that Makwan's beaten out of those 7 is still in the UFC. Hasn't competed since Makwan beat him. And that's Danny Henry back in 2020. So for Makwan, I too will say I have a hard time gauging him. And I say that Mike Grundy was released after he lost to Makwan. So it's only Danny Henry that's left.
And it really feels like Makwan Amirkhani has become a guy who other people build their name off of. Let's just call it what it is. Like, Makwan Amirkhani, you don't really think of as the prospect that he once was. Because when he did have that...
Who's buying stock on Kemwella Kirk other than me?
Lerone Murphy got a pretty big bump after it. I know he hasn't fought since, but still, Lerone Murphy's a really good fighter. So I think that was probably the marquee win of his career. But still, Shane Burgos was somewhat unproven up until he beat the brakes off of Amirkhani. Arnold Allen had a close fight with him. I thought Arnold Allen won. It's an awful fight. I do not recommend going back and watching it. And I love Arnold Allen. Like, I thoroughly enjoy watching most of his fights, but boy, that one was terrible. The thing with Amirkhani is, though, and you hit it right on the head, did we learn anything even though we beat Mike Grundy in a minute? Not at all. Mike Grundy put himself in a bad position, and Amirkhani took advantage of that. But guess what? You're an MMA fighter at the UFC level. I expect you to be able to do things like that. So for Amirkhani, I still think more about the negatives that we saw in that 3-fight losing streak, more than the positive win over Mike Grundy. Because like you said, Grundy himself wasn't necessarily the hottest show in town at the time. Like, he was also a guy who had experienced some losses in the UFC. Like, he wasn't really at the peak of his powers, if there ever was a peak of his powers, Mike Grundy. So I do think Amirkhani still does need this win. It's a very important win for his career because Jonathan Pearce has gotten the bad taste out of most people's mouths that the Joe Lozon loss left. Because I know I was very down on him. Everyone loves bringing it up. But the Kamaka the third win was really nice. I don't think the highest of Kamaka the third, if I'm being honest, but still.
And I do.
Exactly, something we are allowed to disagree on. But the Omar Morales one was genuinely impressive. The way that he was able to avoid any big shots from him. He looked really good with his own wrestling, was able to take Morales down multiple times, and he had the killer instinct in that fight. But the problem for me is, and I don't know if I'm overthinking this, so I guess I'll hand it off to you after this. I don't like it when a guy gets a good win on his record and then almost takes a step back at his next win. Like after you beat a guy like Omar Morales, you should be set up for something bigger. Fight a Jim Miller maybe near the end of his career. Fight an older cowboy. Like get a matchup like that. The Christian Rodriguez win was a really nice win, but I don't think that taught me anything that the Omar Morales performance didn't already do.
It taught me something negative. So I just want to go back and then I'll go forward. If you look at it for Makwan, again, 7-5 in the UFC, tied for second all time in UFC featherweight history with submission wins. He has 4. Charles Oliveira has 6. But the thing about Makwan, and this kind of goes to speak about Mr. Jonathan Pearce, 1.36 significant strikes thrown per minute to 2.41 absorbed for Makwan. That's a negative 1.05. UFC average for and against is 3.38 per minute. So he's way below in terms of what he throws. He's below in terms of what he receives, but he doesn't strike a whole heck of a lot. He does tend to hold his hands low. He has the threat of the takedown. He is a tricky guy to try and figure out. And obviously he can be lights out on the ground. We do know this, but when I look at Jonathan Pearce, like the loss to Joe Lozon, is it one of those ones, like to me, it's like Ricky Simone lost to Uriah Faber, and I consider that an anomaly. I talked about that last week. I consider the Pearce loss to Lozon a little bit of a speed bump on the career. But to touch on what you said, you look at the 3-fight win streak that Pearce has in terms of takedowns, in terms of control time. Like Pearce was a state runner-up at Science Hill back in Tennessee. And I mean, I talk about this all the time because he used to wrestle below 125 pounds. Then he finally grew into his body. He went 5 of 7 on takedowns against Kai Kamaka III, 6 of 11 against Omar Morales, and he went 6 of 10 against Christian Rodriguez. Rodriguez stepped in on less than a week's notice for Austin Lingo back in February. So that's why you have Rodriguez, who moved up a weight class, take the fight. 11 minutes and 17 seconds of control time for Mr. JSP. But the trouble is, go back and watch that third round. Like Christian Rodriguez had Jonathan Pearce in some really compromised places on the feet. And that leaves a lot to be desired because JSP wrestles like he's got cardio for days, but he's got like 10-minute cardio.
But you bring up the fact that Mike Grundy struggled that Jonathan Pearce struggled in the third round of his last performance. Makwan Amirkhani, that's like the definition of his fighting style. It's, hey, if it's not growing great in the first round, then you're not going to like what it looks like in the third round. Like, he really does need to get off to a really good start in this fight, but the same thing does have to be said for both these athletes. So I really do think more than anything, and normally it's the other way around, it's, hey, whoever finishes the fight strongest is probably going to win. This fight, more than any, could come down to whoever wins the first round because the last two might be so close that both these guys at 100% gas, that might be the only way that they're able to differentiate themselves in the eyes of the judges. So I really do think that the first offensive takedown landed for either guy is going to be a really important point in this fight because if Jonathan Pearce is able to get on top of Amirkhani, he's going to be able to sap his energy even more than he normally would. But the same thing has to be said for Amirkhani. He likes to go for a very high volume of takedowns. What I don't love out of Amirkhani, though, is he doesn't have great top position. You can get up from under him if he's on top of you. You can bucket the hips. You can make separation. He's not lights out with his jiu-jitsu. He does have good submissions, but sometimes he will lose position going for, a Darce choke over the top or kind of a risky position that a more trained fighter and I know this is a bad example because he's the best, but like a Charles Oliveira doesn't make a mistake like that. Like once he gets that first submission, that's the last submission because he locks it up. With Amirkhani, he does almost have a sloppiness to his game that does work out for him, but I do worry that if he's not able to get that first offensive takedown, he'll be the more tired of these two by the time that third round does come around.
You look at the odds for this fight, Amirkhani opened the underdog plus 160, plus 180 or thereabouts. And if you look at it for Pearce, open minus 185, minus 223 for JSP. Matt, we have a look at the top odds. You both surprised to us as they are to you, as I get an Irish accent to surprise. I'm going to say over under 72.5% Pearce. He's the favorite in this one.
I'll say under.
It is under. So 1,088 total votes, 60% Pearce, 55% by decision, 32% by knockout. For the 40% that have Amirkhani, 23% by decision, 67% have him to win by submission. So this is one of those ones, like, we both kind of touched on the same points. I like the high motor Jonathan Pearce, and I love how he looked against Kai Kamaka. I love how he looked against Omar Morales. I don't necessarily love how he looked against Christian Rodriguez, and I think Rodriguez is a good prospect at 135. I said that before the fight, so I can kind of go back on that forever. it's on the video. But Matt, when I do look at this one for Amirkhani, he does have that much UFC experience. Obviously, he's been with the promotion for 7 years now and 12 fights. So not a guy that competes all the time every other month. But he did pick up a performance bonus his last time in the O2, which was just back in March.
He did. I have a hard time picking Amirkhani, though, just because the win over Mike Grundy didn't mean that much to me in real time. And that's the thing that I do have to remind myself. Like, it's easy to think, oh, Amirkhani ended his losing streak. He righted some of the wrongs. But let's be honest, Mike Grundy rushed headfirst into a rear naked choke, basically, and got finished. It wasn't a good performance whatsoever. And this fight is so weird. Sorry, it was an anaconda. What did I say?
Rear naked, but regardless, go along.
Anyways, it was one of those performances where everything went wrong for Grundy more than everything went right for Amirkhani. So I do have a hard time having more confidence in him than I did before the losing streak. So ever so slightly, I will pick Jonathan Pearce because I do think that if these two get into a prolonged wrestling exchange, Jonathan Pearce will be able to out-wrestle Amirkhani, at least for that first round. And I do think that's how important the first 5 minutes are in this fight. I think whoever wins that first round is going to be able to set themselves up a lot better for 2 and 3 than the person who loses the first.
Eager to see how the weight cut goes for both these guys. For Pearce, big time opportunity to fight outside of those United States. For Makwan Amirkhani, somewhat close to home in Europe. Both of us going with Jonathan Pearce in this matchup. I think Matt Pearce with the takedowns, with the top control, he is relentless when he's going for this stuff. He's one of the bigger guys at 145, which is why I mentioned the weight cut. So eager to see both these guys on the scales on Friday to make an assessment on Saturday, which brings up Fight Night Picks question mark kicks 2 hours before the prelims. And Matt, that one's early on Saturday morning again, because it's another early Fight Night card. So look out for the link on that one here on the channel. It should be a big time weekend of fights, headlined by Curtis Razor Blaydes taking on Tom of No Fix nickname Aspinall. Should be a great one. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, as we always say.
Let's get into it.